The rain fell like it was trying to wash away the world that night. Ethan's parents drove in silence, their faces lit by the dull reflection of passing headlights in the back seat. Ethan pressed his small hands against the fogged window, watching the world blur past. He didn't understand the silence, only that something inside him felt like it was breaking. When they reached the orphanage, his mother's trembling fingers brushed through his hair one last time before she turned away. His father couldn't even look at him. The heavy wooden doors closed, and Ethan's world went quiet except for the storm outside. Inside those walls, surrounded by strangers, he realized what abandonment truly meant. Not just being left behind, but being forgotten by the only people who were supposed to stay. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the world still felt heavy. Ethan sat by the window, watching other children play in the courtyard, laughter echoing through stone walls that felt too big for him. Sister Agnes placed a bowl of porridge in front of him and a gentle hand on his shoulder. For the first time, he didn't cry. He just whispered to himself that he would remember his parents' faces forever, so that someday, when they came back, he'd know who they were. Days passed. Ethan learned routines: when to wake, when to eat, when to smile. But each night, he pressed his face to the cold window, hoping to see headlights on the road. Hope became habit, and habit became silence. One evening, Sister Agnes found him sketching shapes in the dust on the floor. Buildings, rooftops, doorways. "What are you drawing?" she asked softly. "Home," he said. It was the first word she'd heard from him in days. That night, Ethan dreamed of his parents, not as they were when they left, but as he wished they'd been. Smiling, arms open, waiting for him at a doorway that never closed. When he awoke, tears dampened his pillow. But somewhere inside, something had begun to grow. Not bitterness, but the fragile seed of strength. Years passed within the quiet rhythm of the orphanage. Ethan no longer waited at the window each night. Instead, he found solace in his sketches, shapes and lines that gave order to the chaos he carried inside. Sister Agnes often watched him draw, her heart aching with pride and sorrow. She saw in him a rare resilience, the kind that's born only from heartbreak. Every page became a small rebellion, a whisper that he would not be broken. When other boys taunted him for being quiet, Ethan never responded. He simply turned away, walking toward the garden where silence waited for him. There, beneath the old oak tree, he built tiny houses from sticks and stones. He didn't need words, only imagination strong enough to build worlds from broken pieces. On quiet nights, Ethan would sneak into the storage room to look at old newspapers. Sometimes he'd trace his parents' last name in the classifieds, wondering if they still existed somewhere, if they ever thought of him. The pain didn't vanish. It hardened into focus, shaping who he was becoming. One evening, Sister Agnes handed him a fresh sketchbook. "Dreams belong to those brave enough to draw them," she said. Ethan looked up at her, unsure how to thank her. For the first time, he smiled, a small, uncertain thing that carried the weight of years. That night, Ethan filled the first page with lines that curved into hope. Towers and bridges, sunlight and open doors. Things he had never truly seen, but always believed should exist. The storm of his childhood had not washed him away. It had carved him into someone new. By the time Ethan left St. Mary's, the world outside felt too wide, too bright. He was 18, carrying only a sketchbook and a quiet determination that refused to fade. College was a dream made possible by Sister Agnes's faith and a scholarship she helped him find. In every brick building and crowded classroom, Ethan saw pieces of his past, broken foundations waiting to be rebuilt. Ethan studied architecture like a man starving for meaning. Every line he drew, every model he built, was a prayer for the child who once dreamed beneath an orphanage roof. His professors admired his precision, but none could see the heart behind it, the promise he'd made to himself long ago, to build places no one could be abandoned in. Years later, Ethan's work began to draw attention. His first project, a modest community shelter, wasn't glamorous, but it was real. The day it opened, he stood among families finding warmth for the first time in years. Watching their faces, he realized his buildings weren't structures. They were second chances made of steel and light. In time, his reputation grew. He designed homes that breathed light and dignity into forgotten neighborhoods. Yet, in the quiet after each success, Ethan felt a familiar emptiness. His heart could rebuild worlds, but not the family he had lost. And so he kept working, believing creation could substitute for closure. One afternoon, as Ethan presented his designs to a nonprofit board, a woman approached him afterward. Her name was Lila. She praised his work but asked a question that caught him off guard. "Do you ever build for yourself?" He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled politely, unaware that her question would soon change the rhythm of his entire life. The city's skyline shimmered with glass and ambition when Ethan received a new project, revitalizing a neglected district into affordable homes. It was the kind of work he lived for, giving form to forgotten hope. As he walked through the crumbling streets with Lila by his side, something deep within him stirred. The buildings reminded him of his childhood, abandoned, silent, waiting for someone to believe in them again. Weeks into the project, Ethan met with residents applying for new housing. Most faces were strangers, each one carrying a story etched in quiet endurance. Then, across the waiting room, he saw them. The couple was older, worn by years and hardship, but there was no mistaking the eyes he once knew in the dark. His parents. The world seemed to tilt as memories he had buried roared back to life. The meeting ended, but Ethan couldn't move. His mind echoed with the sound of rain, of doors closing, of childhood prayers unanswered. Lila called his name softly, but her voice barely reached him. He watched his parents leave the building, their steps slow, their faces hollow. For the first time in years, he felt 8 years old again. Alone at the orphanage gate, clutching a bear against the storm. That night, Ethan sat in his apartment staring at an old photograph Sister Agnes had once given him. The only one of him as a child. He placed it beside a recent project blueprint, tracing the outlines of walls and windows with trembling fingers. The same question circled in his mind. Could the people who had once broken him be the ones he was meant to rebuild? The next morning, Ethan returned to the project site, his resolve uncertain. Lila noticed the distant look in his eyes and didn't ask questions. Instead, she simply said, "Sometimes the hardest walls to rebuild aren't made of brick." Her words lingered as Ethan watched workers lay the foundation. Deep down, he knew this project had become something else entirely. A crossroads between past and forgiveness. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about them. Their eyes, older and softer than he remembered, held a question he had never been ready to answer. "Do you forgive us?" Anger clawed at his chest, years of abandonment pressing down. But in the quiet corners of his mind, Sister Agnes' words echoed. "Mercy builds what anger destroys." He realized that the choice was his alone. He thought about every lonely night at the orphanage, every blueprint he had drawn, and every family he had helped. Could he deny his parents help now, knowing the world could be cruel enough to leave them abandoned too? The anger inside him fought against compassion, but he knew that building walls around his heart wouldn't repair anything. Later that week, Ethan invited his parents to visit a small, anonymous apartment he had prepared for them. They arrived with hesitant steps, unaware that the doors he opened were guided by forgiveness, not resentment. Silence filled the room until Margaret's trembling voice broke through, and Thomas's eyes glistened with shame. Ethan didn't speak immediately. He only smiled softly, letting them feel the weight and relief of unspoken understanding. The days that followed were cautious but tender. Ethan guided them through routines they had long forgotten. Cooking, grocery shopping, even learning to laugh at trivial mistakes. Slowly, trust began to grow where fear had once resided. It was not an immediate reunion, but a fragile bridge, built one careful step at a time. Ethan lay awake that night, listening to the soft sounds of his parents asleep in the rooms beyond. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel the weight of abandonment. Instead, there was quiet pride. Not in vengeance, not in revenge, but in choosing to be the person his younger self had hoped he could become. Mercy, he realized, was the architecture of the soul. Ethan didn't stop at forgiveness. He quietly began helping his parents rebuild their lives. He refurbished their old home, replacing broken windows and rotting wood with careful hands. Every nail he drove and every coat of paint he applied was a testament not to their mistakes, but to the power of second chances. It was hard work, but Ethan felt a peace he hadn't known since childhood. Neighbors noticed the transformation and began to smile, to ask questions. Ethan didn't boast. He simply guided his parents through the work, teaching them to care for the home as he had once been taught to care for himself. Walls weren't the only things rebuilt. They rebuilt trust, humility, and patience. Lila visited often, offering quiet support. She admired Ethan's dedication, not just to buildings, but to the people who had once hurt him. Together, they discovered that restoration wasn't about erasing the past. It was about layering hope upon memory, brick by brick, moment by moment. Evenings became the quietest, most meaningful time. They sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes tears. Ethan listened more than he spoke, learning who they had become and allowing himself to let go of who they had once been. Every shared meal, every gentle conversation became a cornerstone of a family reborn. Months later, the house stood fully restored. Not perfect, but alive. Ethan realized that forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a process, a continuous choice. As he stepped back to admire their work, he felt a deep serenity, knowing he had given his parents more than a home. He had given them dignity, and in doing so, healed a part of himself too. Years later, Ethan returned to the place where it all began, the grounds of St. Mary's Orphanage. The old stone walls were still there, but this time, they weren't empty. He had built something new. A community center for children who, like him, had once known only abandonment. The first time he walked through the doors, he felt the weight of decades lift. Hope had returned where loss once ruled. The opening day was filled with life. Children explored classrooms, artists painted murals, and volunteers arranged books and toys. Ethan moved quietly among them, watching joy and curiosity bloom where fear had once grown. Every smile reminded him why he had endured, why he had forgiven, and why he had kept dreaming. Among the crowd, Ethan spotted two older figures hesitating at the entrance. His heart skipped. It was them, Margaret and Thomas. They had traveled to witness the culmination of his work. Unsure if they belonged in this world he had built from heartbreak and hope. Their eyes met, and in that instant, words were unnecessary. Forgiveness had grown into something tangible, a shared bond that no time could erase. The ceremony began, and Ethan addressed the small crowd, speaking not just of buildings and plans, but of love, forgiveness, and second chances. Tears ran down faces, both young and old, as he shared the story of a boy abandoned, a boy who had chosen mercy over bitterness, and a man who had built more than walls. He had built home. As the day ended, Ethan walked among the children one last time, Lila at his side. He looked up at the walls that once held sorrow and now overflowed with laughter. In that moment, he realized that life had given him far more than he had ever imagined. Not just the chance to rebuild what was broken, but the power to transform it into something beautiful. Beyond his wildest dreams, he had finally come home.